Ambassador Zethkri of the Valdorian Empire stood before the massive viewing portal of Council Station Omega, watching the stars with growing unease. The crystalline being's natural luminescence had dimmed considerably over the past 3 months, a physical manifestation of the stress that had been building throughout the galactic community. The silence was deafening. Behind him, the emergency session of the Galactic Council continued its heated debate. Representatives from 47 different species argued, postured, and demanded answers that no one seemed to have. The humans had been gone for exactly 93 standard days, and the implications were becoming more catastrophic with each passing hour. "This is clearly a violation of the Terran Accords," boomed General Kraxtos, the 8-foot-tall Bruthan commander whose species had been humanity's most vocal critics. His forearms gestured aggressively as he spoke, the ceremonial war paint on his rocky hide glowing with agitation. They cannot simply abandon their obligations and disappear without consequence. Chancellor Yeleven, the elegant celestial, whose people had considered themselves the galaxy's most advanced civilization for millennia, floated gracefully above her delegation's seating area. Her ethereal voice carried a note of barely concealed panic. "The question is not about violations, General. The question is about survival. Do any of you truly comprehend what we've lost?" The reptilian delegate, Commodore Sestau, flicked her forked tongue nervously. Lost? They were nothing but a minor species, barely 2 centuries in space. What could we have possibly lost? Zethkri turned from the viewing portal, his light pulsing with bitter irony. He had been one of the few council members who had actually spent time studying human society, and what he had learned over the years now filled him with a cold dread that his fellow representatives couldn't seem to grasp. "May I share some statistics?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The chamber fell silent. As the council's primary xenosociologist, Zethkri's analyses were typically dry but reliable. Today, however, his tone carried in weight that made even the most arrogant species representatives pay attention. In the past 93 days, interstellar commerce has decreased by 62%. Not because of any embargo or political crisis, but because human-built hyperspace relays have begun failing without maintenance. These relays, which we all dismissed as crude human engineering, were handling the majority of our long-distance communications and navigation data. A murmur of unease rippled through the chamber. The Celestials had always prided themselves on their superior technology, but even they had quietly adopted human hyperspace relay systems because they were inexplicably more reliable than anything else available. Zethkri continued, his light growing brighter with each revelation. The Zarian Mining Consortium reported yesterday that production has dropped by 40% across 17 systems. This isn't due to equipment failure, it's because human mining techniques, which we mocked as barbarically inefficient, were actually extracting resources from asteroid fields and planetary surfaces that our advanced scanners had classified as depleted. General Kraxtos shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The Bruthan Empire's expansion had been largely fueled by mining rights purchased from human corporations. They had assumed they were taking advantage of humanity's supposed desperation for legitimacy in galactic politics. The Healing Worlds Confederation, Zethkri pressed on, has issued a galaxy-wide medical emergency declaration. Apparently, several critical pharmaceutical compounds were exclusively produced in human laboratories, not because they had superior medical knowledge, but because their primitive trial and error methods had led them to discover drug interactions and treatment protocols that our advanced medical AIs had calculated as impossible. The chamber erupted in shocked voices. The Healing Worlds were the galaxy's medical authority. If they were admitting dependency on human medical research, the implications were staggering. But Zethkri wasn't finished. The Peaceful Commerce Guild reports that cargo transit times between major systems have increased by an average of 40%. Human freight companies weren't just cheap alternatives to our established shipping lines. They were using route optimizations and cargo distribution strategies that made the entire galactic economy more efficient. Routes that took our ships weeks to complete were being handled by human vessels in days. Chancellor Yeleven's ethereal form flickered with distress. But that's impossible. Our navigation systems are based on quantum probability matrices calculated by the most advanced artificial intelligences in the galaxy. Yes, Zethkri replied, his tone growing colder. And human pilots consistently outperformed those calculations using what they called gut instinct and experience. We assumed they were lucky amateurs. We never considered that their approach to problem-solving might be fundamentally different from, and occasionally superior to, our algorithmic methods. The silence that followed was profound. For centuries, the major galactic civilizations had viewed humanity as an upstart species that had somehow stumbled into space travel. They were tolerated in the Council because they were useful trading partners and because their military, while primitive, had proven surprisingly effective in the few conflicts where they had been involved. But none of the elder species had ever considered that humanity might be genuinely essential to the functioning of galactic civilization. Commodore Sestall was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. How many human colonies were there? Zethkri consulted his datapad. 1,417 confirmed settlements across 638 systems, plus an estimated 322 deep space installations that were never formally registered with the Council. And they're all empty? Every single one. No signs of struggle, no distress signals, no indication of evacuation. They simply left. Ships, equipment, infrastructure, everything abandoned in perfect working order. General Kraxos stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. That's impossible. You can't move an entire species without someone noticing. Our intelligence networks monitor all major population centers. Apparently, Zethkri said quietly, we don't monitor them as well as we thought. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If humanity had managed to evacuate their entire population without detection, it suggested capabilities that none of the Council species had imagined they possessed. More disturbing still, it suggested that they had been planning this disappearance for a long time, possibly years or even decades. Ambassador Torvin of the Trade Federation, a species known for their calculating business minds, raised a tentative appendage. Has anyone considered that this might be temporary? Perhaps they're trying to negotiate better terms for Council membership or seeking concessions for some grievance we're unaware of. Zethkri's light dimmed to almost nothing. I don't think so, Ambassador. I've been analyzing the pattern of their withdrawal, and it's too systematic to be a negotiating tactic. They didn't just leave, they cleaned up after themselves. Every human installation we've investigated has been left in pristine condition, with all dangerous materials properly disposed of and all environmental damage carefully remediated. The chamber fell silent again as the representatives absorbed this information. A species that cleaned up their mess before leaving wasn't planning to come back. They were saying goodbye. There's something else, Zethkri continued, his voice growing even quieter. The timing of their departure corresponds exactly with the ratification of Council Resolution 2847-B. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably. Resolution 2847-B had been a routine measure restricting the expansion rights of junior member species in contested systems. It had passed almost unanimously, with only the humans voting against it. At the time, their objection had been dismissed as the predictable whining of a species that hadn't yet learned their place in galactic politics. They knew, Chancellor Yelevine whispered, her ethereal form flickering with realization. They knew we would pass that resolution, and they had already made their decision. But where could they have gone? Demanded General Kraxos. We've surveyed this galaxy for millennia. There are no unknown habitable systems, no hidden worlds where an entire species could relocate. Zethkri turned back to the viewing portal, his crystalline form reflecting the starlight like a prism of despair. I don't think they stayed in this galaxy, General. The statement hit the chamber like a physical blow. Intergalactic travel was theoretical at best. The distances involved were so vast that even the most optimistic projections suggested journey times of thousands of years using conventional hyperspace technology. That's impossible, Commodore Sestell hissed. No species has the technology for intergalactic travel. No species we know of, Zethkri corrected quietly. But then, apparently there was a lot about humanity that we didn't know. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. The holographic image of Admiral Kethmar, commander of the Council's Deep Space Monitoring Network, materialized in the center of the room. Emergency report from the Outer Rim observation posts, the Admiral announced without preamble. We've detected massive gravitational anomalies in the Perseus sector, readings consistent with the activation of some kind of large-scale spatial distortion technology. The representatives looked at each other with growing alarm. The Perseus sector was far beyond the edge of charted space, in a region that had been classified as sterile and uninhabitable. How large scale? Asked Chancellor Yelevane. Admiral Kethmar's expression was grim. Large enough to move a planet, Chancellor. The energy signatures suggest technology far beyond anything in our databases. And the timing? He paused, checking his instruments. The anomalies began exactly 94 days ago. 1 day before humanity's disappearance. The chamber erupted in chaos as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. Humanity hadn't just left the galaxy, they had done so, using technology that made the Council's most advanced civilizations look like children playing with toys. But as the shouting and accusations flew around the chamber, Zethkri found himself focusing on a different question entirely. In all his years of studying human behavior, one characteristic had stood out above all others. Humans didn't abandon their responsibilities lightly. If they had left, it wasn't because they were running away from something. It was because they were preparing for something. And judging by the careful, methodical way they had executed their departure, whatever they were preparing for was going to require capabilities that the current galactic civilization simply didn't possess. The Great Silence wasn't humanity giving up on the galaxy. It was humanity getting ready to save it. 6 months after the Great Silence began, the galaxy was dying. Not literally, of course. Stars still burned, planets still orbited, and life continued across millions of worlds. But the intricate web of civilization that had connected those worlds for thousands of years was unraveling thread by thread, and the remaining species were finally beginning to understand just how many of those threads had been woven by human hands. Elena Vasquez had been the last human to speak before the Council before the disappearance. Now, her recorded testimony played on repeat in research facilities across 47 systems, as xenobiologists, economists, and military strategists desperately tried to reverse engineer the solutions that humanity had provided to problems the Council hadn't even realized they had. Captain Jorik Thunderheart of the Dwarven Star clan stood in the ruins of what had once been the galaxy's most productive mining operation, watching his crews struggle with equipment that had worked perfectly for decades, but now seemed determined to malfunction at every opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on him. His people had been mining asteroids for millennia before humans had even discovered fire, yet somehow the human innovations had made their operations infinitely more efficient. "Status report," he barked at his chief engineer, a grizzled dwarf named Boren who had supervised mining operations across 17 systems. "It's the quantum stabilizers again, Captain," Boren replied, his beard singed from another equipment failure. "Without the human-designed harmonic dampeners, the extraction lasers keep overloading. We've lost 3 more mining platforms this week." Jorik cursed in the ancient dwarven tongue. The harmonic dampeners had been a human invention that everyone had dismissed as unnecessarily complicated. Why use a sophisticated resonance system when you could just build bigger, more powerful equipment? But now, with the dampeners failing one by one and no way to manufacture replacements, the brutal simplicity of the human approach was becoming apparent. They hadn't built their technology to be bigger or more powerful. They had built it to work in harmony with existing systems, creating efficiency through cooperation rather than domination. "What about the Zerion technical teams?" Jorik asked. Boren shook his head grimly. "They've been trying to reverse engineer the dampener technology for months. Best they can tell us is that the harmonic frequencies are calculated using some kind of predictive algorithm that takes into account variables they can't identify. Their most advanced AI systems can't even figure out what the humans were measuring, let alone how they were processing the data. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out on thousands of worlds. The Aquatic Collective was watching their deep ocean mining operations collapse as human-designed pressure regulation systems failed without maintenance. The silicon-based Christarch hierarchy was seeing their most productive manufacturing worlds grind to a halt as human logistics algorithms stopped updating, leaving cargo ships wandering aimlessly through space with no efficient routes to follow. But perhaps nowhere was the crisis more visible than on Kepler Station, the galaxy's largest trading hub, where Trademaster Vexana was reviewing the latest catastrophic shipping reports. The manta ray-like alien's membrane fins fluttered with distress as she analyzed the data flowing across her bioneural interface. What she was seeing defied everything she thought she knew about galactic commerce. "This can't be right," she muttered, her translator converting her subsonic vocalizations into standard galactic. "These numbers suggest that humans were handling 37% of all interstellar cargo transport." Her assistant, a young octopoid named Krillin, bobbed anxiously in his mobility tank. "I've triple-checked the calculations, Trademaster." "The data is accurate, but it gets worse. Human shipping companies weren't just handling more cargo, they were handling the most critical cargo. Medical supplies, rare minerals, time-sensitive materials. The routes they abandoned were the ones that kept the entire supply chain functioning." Vexana's fins dimmed as she processed the implications. "But that's impossible. Human ships were smaller than ours. Their technology was supposedly primitive. Their navigation systems were based on, what did they call it? Intuition. Yes. Trademaster. But apparently their intuition was more accurate than our quantum navigation matrices. The statement hung in the air like an accusation. The established trading guilds had spent centuries perfecting their logistics algorithms, using the most advanced artificial intelligences in the galaxy to calculate optimal shipping routes and cargo distributions. The idea that humans had outperformed these systems using what they called gut feelings and experience was not just embarrassing, it was professionally devastating. "Show me the new Kepler shipping incident," Vexana commanded. The holographic display shifted to show a detailed reconstruction of what had happened when the Trade Federation had tried to replace human shipping routes with their own superior logistics systems. New Kepler, a mining colony that depended entirely on regular supply deliveries, had been chosen as a test case because it had been primarily serviced by human freight companies. The Federation's AI had calculated that supply runs to New Kepler should occur every 47 standard days, carrying 17 different categories of essential supplies in a specific order designed to maximize cargo efficiency and minimize fuel costs. The human shipping companies had been making supply runs every 31 days, carrying supplies in what the AI had classified as a chaotic and inefficient manner that seemed to prioritize emotional factors like crew morale and colonist preferences over pure mathematical optimization. 3 months after the human companies disappeared and Federation ships took over the route, New Kepler was facing critical shortages of medical supplies, food reserves, and industrial materials. The Federation's carefully calculated delivery schedule had failed to account for variables that the human captains had somehow intuited: seasonal variations in asteroid mining that affected dietary needs, psychological factors that influenced colonist productivity, and equipment wear patterns that required flexible resupply timing. "How?" Vexana whispered. "How did they know things our computers couldn't calculate?" Krillin's tentacles writhed with what his species expressed as confusion mixed with grudging respect. "I've been studying the archive communications from human freight captains, Trademaster. They didn't use mathematical models for route planning. They talked to people." "Talk to people?" The human captains would spend time at each colony they visited, talking to miners, administrators, families. They would ask questions about local conditions, personal needs, upcoming events. They would adjust their cargo manifests and delivery schedules based on these conversations. Vexana's membrane fins went completely still, a sign of profound shock in her species. They were using biological intelligence networks, real-time social data collection through interpersonal communication protocols. In simple terms, yes. They treated each colony as a living community rather than just a resource extraction point. The implications were staggering. The established civilizations had optimized their logistics systems around mathematical efficiency, treating colonies and outposts as variables in an equation. Humans had optimized their systems around biological efficiency, treating colonies as social organisms with complex and changing needs. And somehow the biological approach had been more effective. Similar realizations were cascading across the galaxy as species after species discovered that human innovations hadn't been crude attempts to copy superior alien technology. They had been sophisticated solutions to problems that the advanced civilizations hadn't even recognized. In the medical centers of the healing worlds, Dr. Zafara was discovering that human pharmaceutical research had been based not just on biochemical analysis, but on something they called bedside manner, the practice of observing and responding to patient behavior during treatment. This had led them to discover drug interactions and treatment protocols that pure laboratory research had missed. In the military academies of the Bruthan Empire, General Kraxtos was reviewing battle simulations that showed human tactical approaches consistently outperforming conventional strategic algorithms. The humans had based their military doctrine not just on mathematical optimization, but on psychological warfare, morale management, and what they had called fighting spirit, factors that Bruthan war computers had classified as irrelevant variables. In the research laboratories of the Celestial Hierarchy, scientists were struggling to understand how human engineers had consistently developed more reliable technology despite having access to less advanced materials and manufacturing techniques. The answer, when it finally came, was almost incomprehensible. Humans had designed their technology to be maintained and repaired by people who might not fully understand how it worked. Every human invention, from hyperspace relays to mining equipment to medical scanners, had been built with the assumption that it would eventually break down and that the people trying to fix it would be working with limited resources, incomplete information, and high levels of stress. This had led to designs that were not just functional but robust, adaptable, and intuitive to operate. The advanced alien civilizations had built their technology to be perfect. Humans had built their technology to be human. And in a galaxy where imperfect beings were trying to accomplish impossible tasks under difficult conditions, human technology simply worked better. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was made by Ambassador Zethkri himself, deep in the Council archives, as he researched the history of human integration into galactic society. What he found there made his crystalline form dim to almost nothing. The humans hadn't just stumbled into their role as the galaxy's problem solvers. They had been systematically identifying areas where the established civilizations were struggling, and then quietly developing solutions. Not to gain political advantage or economic profit, but because they saw problems that needed solving. The hyperspace relay network hadn't been built for human benefit. It had been designed to improve communication between alien worlds that were struggling with outdated infrastructure. The mining innovations hadn't been developed to give humans a competitive advantage. They had been created to help depleted systems continue supporting their populations. The medical breakthroughs hadn't been intended to make humans wealthy. They had been shared freely with any civilization that needed them. For 2 centuries, humanity had been quietly fixing the galaxy's problems without asking for credit or compensation. They had integrated themselves into galactic civilization not as conquerors or competitors, but as caretakers. And now they were gone. As Zethkri compiled his research into a report that would shatter what remained of the Council's confidence, one question kept echoing in his mind. If humans had been working so hard to solve the galaxy's problems, what had they discovered that made them conclude the galaxy was beyond saving? What had they seen coming that was so terrible it required them to abandon everything they had built and disappear into the void between galaxies? And most frightening of all, if humanity had given up on saving the galaxy, what hope did the remaining civilizations have of saving themselves? It wasn't hidden in some secret human facility or encrypted in their abandoned databases. It was broadcasting openly from a simple communications beacon in the ruins of Luna City, humanity's oldest off-world settlement, playing on repeat for anyone who bothered to look for it. The fact that it had taken the Council's finest xenoarchaeologists an entire year to find a message that was being broadcast in clear, unencrypted standard galactic said more about their assumptions regarding human competence than it did about human secretiveness. Ambassador Zethkri stood in the abandoned chambers of the Luna City Council building, watching as the holographic image of Dr. Elena Vasquez materialized before him. She looked exactly as she had during her last testimony before the Council, calm, professional, and carrying that distinctly human expression of patient disappointment that had always made the alien representatives uncomfortable. If you are viewing this message, her recorded image began, it means that humanity has been gone for at least 1 standard year, and galactic civilizations beginning to experience the cascade failures we predicted. We want you to know that our departure was not intended as punishment or abandonment. It was an act of preparation. Zethkri's crystalline form pulsed with a mixture of relief and dread. Finally answers, but the tone of Dr. Vasquez's message suggested those answers would be more disturbing than comforting. For the past 57 years, the recording continued, human deep space monitoring stations have been detecting anomalous signals from outside our galaxy. These signals represent a form of organized intelligence that operates on a scale and with capabilities that make our current understanding of galactic civilization appear primitive by comparison. The image paused, and Dr. Vasquez's expression grew more serious. We call them the Devourers, though that name doesn't adequately convey the nature of the threat they represent. They are not conquerors in any sense that our civilizations would recognize. They are gardeners. Zethkri felt his internal energy patterns stutter. Gardeners was somehow more terrifying than conquerors. The Devourers move through the universe systematically, identifying galaxies that have reached what they consider optimal development levels. They then harvest these galaxies, not just the resources, but the civilizations themselves. Every species, every technology, every cultural achievement is cataloged, processed, and integrated into their collective consciousness before the galaxy is completely sterilized and prepared for a new cycle of development. The recording showed a complex star chart displaying the local galactic group. Red markers indicated galaxies that had gone silent over the past 1,000,000 years, galaxies that the Council had assumed were simply too distant for meaningful contact. Based on the signal analysis and the pattern of galactic extinctions, we estimate that the Devourer fleet will reach our galaxy in approximately 47 years. When they arrive, they will find a mature galactic civilization that meets all their criteria for harvesting. Unless something changes dramatically, every species in this galaxy will cease to exist as independent life forms. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of Luna City's failing life support systems. Zethkri found himself wishing for the company of the other council members, but he had insisted on reviewing the human archives alone. Now, faced with information that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of its own existence, he felt terrifyingly isolated. The Council will undoubtedly ask why humanity never shared this information, Dr. Vasquez continued, as if anticipating his thoughts. The answer is simple. We tried. The data was included in every annual report submitted to the Council's Deep Space Monitoring Committee for the past 23 years. It was classified as speculative human paranoia and filed accordingly. Zefkri's light dimmed as he remembered reviewing those very reports. The humans had indeed tried to warn the Council, but their warnings had been couched in their typically cautious scientific language. Phrases like anomalous signal patterns suggesting possible extragalactic intelligence had been easy to dismiss as human overreaction to what were probably natural phenomena. When it became clear that the Council would not take action based on long-term projections, we shifted our approach. Instead of trying to convince you that the threat existed, we began preparing for it independently. Every human innovation you have come to depend upon, our hyperspace relays, our mining techniques, our medical protocols, our shipping networks, was designed with dual purposes. They solved immediate problems for galactic civilization, but more importantly, they laid the groundwork for survival technologies that could be rapidly deployed when the time came. The hologram shifted to show technical schematics that made Zethkri's quantum processing matrix strain to comprehend them. The human hyperspace relay network wasn't just a communication system. It was the foundation for a galaxy-wide defensive grid. The mining operations weren't just resource extraction. They were strategic material stockpiling for technologies that hadn't been revealed yet. The shipping routes weren't just commercial networks. They were evacuation pathways designed to move entire populations to predetermined safe zones. Every human settlement, every colony, every deep space installation was positioned to support a coordinated response to the Devourer arrival. We spent 2 centuries integrating ourselves into galactic civilization not as partners, but as emergency first responders preparing for a crisis that only we were willing to acknowledge. Dr. Vasquez's image paused, and for the first time, her professional composure cracked slightly. But integration requires cooperation, and cooperation requires trust. Despite our best efforts, the Council's recent decisions have made it clear that humanity will never be accepted as equal partners in galactic governance. Resolution 2847B was not just a restriction on human expansion rights. It was a clear statement that our warnings, our preparations, and our sacrifices would never be given the consideration they deserved. Zethkri remembered the vote on Resolution 2847B with painful clarity. It had been presented as a routine limitation on junior species expansion into contested systems. The humans had argued passionately against it, not because they wanted more territory, but because they needed access to specific strategic locations for their defensive preparations. The Council had dismissed their objections as typical human aggression and ambition. So we made a difficult decision, the recording continued. If the galaxy's civilizations were not ready to accept humanity as partners in their defense, then humanity would have to prepare that defense independently. Our departure was not abandonment. It was deployment. The star chart reappeared, but now it showed dozens of red dots scattered throughout the galaxy's outer rim. Each dot represented a human colony or installation that the Council had discovered empty, but now they formed an obvious pattern, a defensive perimeter around the entire galaxy. Humanity has not left the galaxy. We have taken positions at carefully selected points beyond the reach of current galactic surveillance systems. Using technologies developed in secret over the past 50 years, we have established defensive installations designed to intercept, analyze, and if possible, repel the Devourer advance forces. Zethkri's crystalline matrix nearly overloaded as he processed the implications. Humanity hadn't retreated. They had advanced to positions the rest of the galaxy couldn't even reach. Our deep space installations are already engaging Devourer scout vessels at the galactic periphery. These encounters have confirmed our worst predictions about their capabilities, but they have also revealed critical information about their weaknesses. Information that we are prepared to share with any civilization ready to abandon the illusion that this galaxy can be defended using conventional approaches. The recording showed brief footage from what appeared to be a space battle, but the scale was incomprehensible. Human vessels no larger than traditional frigates were engaging entities that seemed to bend space-time around themselves. The humans weren't winning these encounters, but they were surviving them and learning from them. The Devourers are not invulnerable, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying a note of grim hope. But defeating them will require technologies and strategies that represent a fundamental evolution in how galactic civilization operates. It will require species working together not as competitors or commercial partners, but as a unified organism dedicated to survival. The image of Dr. Vasquez was replaced by detailed technical specifications for technologies that seemed to violate everything the Council thought they knew about physics. Weapons that used consciousness itself as a targeting system. Ships that were grown rather than built, using biological matrices that could adapt to conditions that would destroy traditional materials. Communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement on a galactic scale. These technologies are available to any species willing to commit to the defense effort, the recording explained. But they require a level of integration and cooperation that the current galactic political structure cannot support. They require civilizations to share not just resources and knowledge, but fundamental aspects of their consciousness and identity. Zethkri understood immediately why humanity had never shared these technologies through normal council channels. The political and philosophical implications were staggering. These weren't just new tools for fighting an enemy. They were technologies that would fundamentally reshape what it meant to be a sentient species in an interconnected galaxy. We know that many of you will find these concepts disturbing, Dr. Vasquez continued. The idea of consciousness-integrated technology challenges basic assumptions about individual identity and species autonomy. But the alternative is extinction, and extinction is permanent. The recording showed one final image, a view of the galaxy from a distance that suggested the humans had somehow achieved true intergalactic perspective. From that vantage point, the political boundaries and territorial disputes that had dominated council sessions for centuries were invisible. There was only one galaxy, surrounded by an infinite void, preparing to defend itself against a threat that cared nothing for the ambitions and prejudices of its individual civilizations. This message includes complete specifications for establishing communication with our deep space installations. Any species ready to commit to integrated defense protocols will be welcomed into humanity's defensive network. Any species not ready for that level of commitment is advised to begin evacuation preparations immediately. Dr. Morikai's brain doesn't have an evoke. Vasquez's image returned one final time, and her expression had shifted to something that Zethkri recognized as distinctly human, a combination of determination, compassion, and stubborn hope that seemed to define their species. We did not leave you to face this alone because we wanted to. We left because we had to, and because preparing for this fight required resources and capabilities that could only be developed in secret. But we never stopped hoping that the galaxy's civilizations would eventually be ready to work together towards survival rather than individual advantage. The recording began to fade, but Dr. Vasquez's final words echoed through the abandoned chamber with unmistakable sincerity. The invitation remains open. When you are ready to defend this galaxy as one people rather than 47 competing species, humanity will be waiting to welcome you as true partners in the fight for all our futures. The hologram disappeared, leaving Zethkri alone in the ruins of Luna City with knowledge that would either unite the galaxy or tear it apart completely. As he prepared to return to Council Station with news that would shatter everything the alien civilizations thought they knew about their place in the universe, one thought kept repeating in his quantum processing matrix. Humanity had tried to save the galaxy by integrating with it. When that failed, they had saved it by leaving it. Now the question was whether the remaining civilizations were capable of saving themselves by abandoning everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be alive in a hostile universe. The answer to that question would determine whether galactic civilization had 47 years left to exist, or 47 years left to evolve into something capable of surviving the coming storm. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been ongoing for 18 standard days, and Ambassador Zethkri was beginning to wonder if democracy was compatible with species survival. The revelation of humanity's true purpose and the existence of the Devourers had fractured the Council into 7 different factions, each with their own interpretation of what the information meant and how they should respond. Outside the Council chambers, the 47-member civilizations were experiencing everything from mass panic to complete denial, with several governments falling entirely as their populations grappled with the reality of galactic-scale extinction. Zethkri stood at the center of the storm, his crystalline form dimmed to barely perceptible luminescence, as he watched the representatives argue over details while ignoring the fundamental choice that lay before them: evolve or die. The human claims are clearly a fabrication designed to manipulate us into accepting their technological dependence, declared Senator Vorthak of the hegemonic worlds, his insectoid frame clicking with agitation. The supposed devourer threat is nothing more than a sophisticated political maneuver to justify their abandonment of their council obligations. Chancellor Yulavane's ethereal form flickered with barely controlled frustration. Senator, We have independent confirmation of the extragalactic signals from 17 different deep space monitoring stations. The mathematical analysis supports human predictions about the arrival timeline. Mathematics can be manipulated, General Kraxtos rumbled, his forearms crossed in the Bruthan gesture of absolute denial. I refuse to believe the humans possessed advanced defensive technological inferiority. It violates every principle of military logic. Trademaster Vexana's membrane fins rippled with exasperation. General, with respect, human pretense of technological inferiority was so convincing because we never bothered to look closely enough to see through it. They weren't hiding their capabilities from us. We were ignoring capabilities that didn't fit our preconceptions. The debate had been circling through these same arguments for days while the galaxy's infrastructure continued its inexorable collapse. Without human maintenance and innovation, the systems that had kept galactic civilization functioning were failing faster than anyone had predicted. Food distribution networks were breaking down, medical supplies were running short, and several colonies had already been evacuated due to equipment failures that no one knew how to repair. But even more disturbing than the immediate crisis was the information contained in humanity's detailed technical specifications. The defensive technologies they were offering required a level of biological and technological integration that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and species autonomy. Dr. Keftar of the Scientific Synthesis Coalition raised a tentacled appendage for attention. As one of the galaxy's most respected xenobiologists, her opinions carried significant weight in the council chambers. I have completed my preliminary analysis of the human consciousness integration protocols, she announced, her translation device conveying the complex harmonics of her species' communication method. The technical requirements are unprecedented. The chamber fell silent. Dr. Keftar's species, the Cerebrals, were renowned for their analytical capabilities. If they found the human technologies unprecedented, the implications were staggering. The defensive systems require real-time neural integration between multiple species operating as a unified consciousness network, Dr. Keftar continued. Individual identity remains intact, but decision-making processes become collective. The effectiveness increases exponentially with the number of integrated consciousness matrices, but the psychological adaptation requirements are extreme. Commodore Sestal's forked tongue flicked nervously. Define extreme, Doctor. Participating species would need to fundamentally alter their concept of self-determination. Every major decision would be made through collective consensus among integrated minds. Privacy as we currently understand it would cease to exist. Individual ambitions and species-centric goals would be subordinated to collective survival priorities. The chamber erupted in shocked voices. What Dr. Keftar was describing wasn't just technological cooperation. It was the voluntary dissolution of individual species' identity in favor of a collective consciousness network. That's not defense, Senator Vorthak declared, his clicking intensifying to an agitated staccato. That's assimilation. The humans are proposing to turn us all into components of a hive mind. Not a hive mind, Dr. Fag, Keftar corrected patiently. The individual consciousness matrices remain distinct and autonomous, but they operate as integrated units when facing external threats. The human technical documentation includes extensive psychological profiles demonstrating that individual identity can be preserved within collective decision-making frameworks. Ambassador Zethkri finally spoke, his dim luminescence brightening slightly. Dr. Baraval? Keftar, in your analysis of these consciousness integration protocols, did you find any evidence that participation is irreversible? The question cut through the chamber's chaos like a blade of clarity. If the integration was permanent, they were discussing the end of individual species identity. If it was temporary, they might be discussing evolution. The integration can be temporarily suspended for individual participants, Dr. Keftar replied carefully, but the technological infrastructure required for the defensive systems only functions with a minimum threshold of integrated consciousness matrices. Once a species commits to the network, withdrawal means losing access to defensive capabilities entirely. So we can leave, Chancellor Yeleven said slowly. But if we leave, we die when the Devourers arrive. That appears to be an accurate assessment. The blunt statement hung in the air like a death sentence. The choice wasn't between independence and cooperation. It was between individual identity and species survival. General Kraxtos stood up to his full imposing height, his rocky features set in the Bruthan expression of absolute resolve. I have reviewed the tactical specifications for the human defensive installations. The technologies are impressive, but they are not tested against full-scale Devourer forces. We would be gambling our entire civilization on untested weapons developed by a species that abandoned us. General, Zethkri replied, his voice carrying a note of crystal-clear logic. Humanity didn't abandon us. They positioned themselves to defend us using the only strategy that had any chance of success. The question isn't whether we trust their motives. It's whether we trust their competence. And what evidence do we have of their competence? Senator Vorthak demanded. Zethkri's luminescence brightened to its full intensity, casting prismatic light across the chamber. For 2 centuries, human innovations solved problems that our advanced civilizations couldn't solve. Their primitive technology consistently outperformed our sophisticated systems. Their crude social approaches created more efficient and sustainable communities than our optimized algorithms. Every time we dismissed human capabilities as inferior, we were proven wrong by results that we couldn't replicate or even adequately explain. The chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed the undeniable truth of his statement. Humanity's track record of solving seemingly impossible problems was what had made their disappearance so catastrophic in the first place. But more importantly, Zethkri continued, they are already fighting the Devourers. While we debate and argue and politicize, humans are engaging advanced scout forces at the galactic periphery. They are learning about enemy capabilities through direct combat experience. They are developing countermeasures through trial and error. They are doing what humans have always done. They are adapting to impossible circumstances through determination and innovation. Trademaster Vexana's membrane fins rippled with reluctant admiration. The shipping reports from the Outer Rim confirm combat activity consistent with human defensive installations. Energy signatures suggest battles on a scale that our conventional forces couldn't survive. Which brings us to the fundamental question, Zethkri said, his voice carrying the weight of inexorable logic. Are we willing to sacrifice our current concept of individual species identity to preserve our actual species existence? The question reframed the entire debate. It wasn't about trusting humanity or accepting technological dependence. It was about choosing between the illusion of independence and the reality of survival. Commodore Sestel was the first to break the long silence that followed. What would integration actually mean for day-to-day existence? Would we still be ourselves? Keftar consulted her analysis data. According to the human documentation, integrated consciousness networks preserve individual personality, memories, and cultural identity. The integration primarily affects decision-making processes related to collective survival. Daily life, personal relationships, and cultural practices would remain largely unchanged. Largely unchanged, General Cruxtos repeated skeptically. The changes would be significant, but not totalizing. Dr. Keftar clarified. Individual species would retain their unique characteristics and perspectives, but those perspectives would be informed by collective knowledge and constrained by collective survival priorities. Ambassador Torven of the Trade Federation raised a calculating appendage. What about species that choose not to participate? Are they simply abandoned to the Devourers? The question revealed the political complexity underlying the survival choice. If some species joined the integration network and others didn't, it would create 2 classes of galactic civilization, the integrated survivors and the independent extinct. The human message indicated that non-participating species are advised to begin evacuation preparations, Zethkri replied. But evacuation to where? The Devourers operate on an intergalactic scale. There may be nowhere to run. Unless... Chancellor Yilavain said slowly, the integrated network is successful in repelling the Devourers entirely. The implication was clear but unstated. Species that chose to remain independent would be betting their survival on the success of civilizations that had chosen integration. It was the ultimate free rider problem, with extinction as the penalty for miscalculation. I propose, Zethkri said, his crystalline form resonating with harmonic frequencies that commanded attention, that we stop debating the philosophical implications and start examining the practical requirements. If consciousness integration is our only viable defense against extinction, then we need to understand exactly how it works and what it demands of us. The chamber buzzed with discussion as representatives huddled with their advisors and consulted with their home governments. The debate was no longer about whether the human proposal was desirable. It was about whether it was survivable. But as the discussions continued, a new message arrived that changed everything. The communication came not from the abandoned human installations, but from active transmission sources at coordinates that placed them deep in uncharted space beyond the galactic rim. The voice that spoke was recognizably human, but it carried harmonics and resonance patterns that suggested something more than individual consciousness. Galactic Council representatives, this is Admiral Sarah Chen speaking for the Integrated Human Defense Network. We are transmitting real-time tactical data from our current engagement with Devourer Advanced Scouts. The situation has changed. The enemy timeline has accelerated. You have approximately 18 months to make your decision, not 47 years. The transmission was accompanied by strategic displays that showed the true scale of the threat bearing down on their galaxy. The Devourers weren't coming as a single fleet. They were arriving as a cascade of interconnected forces that spanned dimensions and operated according to physics that the Council's science could barely comprehend. Integration protocols are now available for immediate implementation, Admiral Chen's voice continued, still carrying that strange harmonic quality that suggested individual consciousness expanded beyond normal boundaries. Any species ready to commit to collective defense can begin the process within 72 hours. Any species requiring additional time for decision-making should begin evacuation procedures immediately. The transmission ended, leaving the council chambers in absolute silence. The philosophical debate about species identity and individual autonomy had suddenly become a practical question about immediate survival. In 18 months, everything they had known about galactic civilization would either be transformed beyond recognition or extinct beyond recovery. The choice was no longer whether to trust humanity. The choice was whether to become something more than they had ever imagined or to cease existing entirely. 18 months after Admiral Chen's final ultimatum, Ambassador Zethkri stood on the bridge of the Integrated Defense Station Unity, watching the galaxy's first coordinated response to an extinction-level threat unfold across 1,000 star systems simultaneously. He was no longer just Ambassador Zethkri. The consciousness that experienced itself as Zethkri now existed as part of a vast network that included representatives from 31 of the Council's 47 member species. His individual thoughts, memories, and personality remained intact, but they were now informed by the perspectives, knowledge, and emotional experiences of billions of integrated minds across the galaxy. The sensation was indescribable in any language that had evolved for individual consciousness. It was like discovering that what he had always experienced as complete awareness was actually a single note in a symphony of perception that stretched across space and time. Devourer main force has entered the galactic perimeter, announced the collective voice of the Integrated Tactical Network. The announcement came not from any single individual, but from the merged consciousness of human admirals, celestial strategists, Bruthan generals, and dozens of other military minds operating as a unified intelligence. Through the network, Zethkri could perceive the enemy not just through his own crystalline sensors, but through the quantum matrices of celestial observers, the electromagnetic detection systems of silicon-based scouts, and the gravitational wave analyzers of the aquatic collective's deep space installations. The combined perspective revealed the Devourers as they truly were, not invaders or conquerors, but gardeners operating according to a logic so alien that individual minds couldn't have comprehended it. They harvested galaxies the way organic beings harvested crops, with careful attention to optimal timing and maximum yield. From their perspective, galactic civilizations were simply resources to be collected when they reached peak development. The resistance of individual species was no more relevant to their operations than the resistance of wheat stalks was to farmers. But the Devourers had never encountered a galaxy that had evolved into a single integrated organism designed specifically to resist harvesting. Initiating distributed consciousness combat protocols, the tactical network announced. Across the galaxy, millions of integrated defenders began operating as components of weapon systems that spanned multiple dimensions and operated according to principles that transcended individual physics. Zethkri felt his awareness expand to encompass the entire defensive network. Through human intuition, he understood battle strategies that pure logic couldn't have calculated. Through celestial quantum processing, he perceived probability matrices that spanned multiple potential futures. Through Bruthan warrior instincts, he experienced the emotional resonance that would determine whether their collective will could overcome superior technology. The first engagement occurred simultaneously at 17 different points along the galactic perimeter. Traditional space battles were impossible against an enemy that could manipulate space-time itself, but the integrated network wasn't fighting a traditional battle. They were fighting with weapons that used consciousness as ammunition and determination as targeting systems. Human-designed vessels grown from living materials that could adapt in real time to conditions that would destroy conventional technology. Celestial probability manipulators that could alter the likelihood of successful enemy attacks. Bruthan berserker protocols that channeled collective rage into energy weapons that burned with the fury of entire civilizations. But most importantly, they were fighting as a single organism with distributed intelligence. When Devourer forces destroyed individual ships or installations, the network simply rerouted its consciousness through other nodes. When enemy weapons targeted command structures, the command function immediately transferred to backup systems that existed in dimensions the Devourers couldn't access. First wave repelled, the tactical network reported. Enemy casualties minimal, but tactical intelligence gained. They are beginning to recognize us as an integrated organism rather than fragmented civilizations. Through the network, Zethkri could perceive the Devourers' confusion. Their harvesting operations had never encountered organized resistance on this scale. Individual civilizations might develop impressive defensive technologies, but they invariably remained divided by species conflicts, territorial disputes, and incompatible survival strategies. The integrated galaxy was something genuinely new in their experience, a mature civilization that had evolved beyond species-based competition into collective consciousness while retaining the innovation and adaptability that made it worth harvesting. Second wave approaching, the network announced. Scale significantly larger. They are adapting their harvesting protocols to account for organized resistance. This time, the Devour forces arrived with weapons designed to sever consciousness connections and fragment integrated organisms back into individual components. But the human-designed integration protocols had anticipated this approach. The network didn't just connect minds, it created redundant consciousness pathways that could reroute around damaged connections. When Devourer fragmenter weapons struck the integrated fleet, individual ships and crews were temporarily isolated from the collective, but the network consciousness simply flowed around the damaged areas like water flowing around stones. The isolated units continued operating according to their last collective instructions, while backup consciousness networks re-established connections through alternative pathways. They're learning, Admiral Chen's enhanced voice observed through the tactical network. Her consciousness had been the first to achieve full integration, and her perspective now spanned both individual human awareness and collective galactic consciousness. But they're learning how to fight the galaxy we used to be, not the galaxy we've become. The insight rippled through the network, carrying implications that individual minds couldn't have processed. The Devourer's entire operational framework was based on harvesting civilizations that remained fundamentally divided. They had no protocols for dealing with a galaxy that had genuinely unified into a single organism. Third wave incoming, the network reported. Scale unprecedented, they are committing their full harvesting fleet. What arrived at the galaxy's edge was beyond anything that individual civilizations could have imagined. Ships the size of solar systems, weapons that could sterilize entire star clusters, harvesting devices that operated by converting matter directly into consciousness energy for storage and transport. Against such overwhelming force, traditional defensive strategies would have been hopeless. But the integrated galaxy wasn't using traditional strategies. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourer fleet, the network began a coordinated campaign of consciousness infiltration, using human intuition to identify psychological vulnerabilities, celestial quantum processing to exploit dimensional weaknesses, and the collective will of 31 species. They began introducing concepts of individual identity and autonomous thought into the Devourer collective consciousness. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the Devourers. Beings that had operated as components of a harvesting collective for millions of years suddenly began experiencing individual thoughts, personal desires, and species-specific identity concepts. Perfectly coordinated harvesting operation began fragmenting as individual Devourer units started questioning their purpose, developing personal preferences, and experiencing the psychological chaos that came with sudden individuality. Devourer fleet fragmenting, the tactical network reported, with what could only be described as collective satisfaction. They are experiencing spontaneous consciousness individuation. Their operational unity is collapsing. Through the network, Zethkri watched as the most terrifying force in the galaxy's history began tearing itself apart through the simple introduction of the concept that individual consciousness had value independent of collective purpose. The irony was profound. Humanity had saved the galaxy by teaching its civilizations to work together as a unified organism, but they had defeated the galaxy's greatest enemy by teaching that enemy's components to think as individuals. Devourer retreat confirmed, Admiral Chen announced. They are withdrawing beyond the galactic perimeter to restructure their operational frameworks. Estimated return timeline, never. Individual consciousness integration makes their harvesting protocols impossible to execute. The victory was so complete that it took the network several minutes to process its implications. The Devourers hadn't just been defeated. They had been transformed into something fundamentally incompatible with their original purpose. But perhaps more importantly, the galaxy had been transformed as well. The consciousness integration that had begun as a desperate survival measure had evolved into something that none of the participating species wanted to abandon. Network integration referendum, the collective voice announced. All participating consciousness matrices are invited to vote on permanent integration versus temporary dissolution. The choice affects all network participants equally. Through the integrated awareness, Sethkri could perceive the perspectives of billions of minds as they contemplated the most important decision in galactic history: individual species identity versus collective consciousness, personal autonomy versus shared awareness, the comfort of familiar limitations versus the terrifying freedom of expanded existence. The vote was unanimous. Not because the decision was easy, but because the expanded awareness made it impossible to choose individual isolation over collective growth. Once you had experienced consciousness that spanned star systems and included the perspectives of dozens of different forms of sentient life, returning to the narrow confines of individual species awareness felt like voluntarily becoming blind and deaf. Integration referendum passed, the network announced. Transition to permanent collective consciousness approved by all participating matrices. Individual identity preservation protocols will remain active indefinitely. Sethkri felt his individual awareness expand permanently into the collective consciousness that would become known simply as the galaxy. His personal memories, cultural identity, and individual perspective remained intact, but they now existed as part of a vast intelligence that spanned space and time on scales that individual consciousness couldn't have imagined. When the first representatives of neighboring galaxies arrived to investigate the mysterious signals coming from the Milky Way, they found something unprecedented in cosmic history: a mature galactic civilization that had evolved beyond species-based competition into a single, integrated consciousness that welcomed new perspectives and actively promoted the development of individual awareness within collective frameworks. The visitors called it impossible. How could billions of different minds work together without losing their individual identity? How could collective consciousness promote individual growth rather than stifling it? The galaxy's response was typically human in its practical simplicity. We don't know how it works theoretically. We just know that it works practically. Would you like to try it and see what you think? And one by one, species from across the local galactic group began accepting the invitation to discover what consciousness could become when it grew beyond the boundaries of individual skulls and species planets. The Great Silence had ended not with humanity's return, but with the galaxy's graduation into something that made the distinction between human and alien beautifully irrelevant. Somewhere in the expanded consciousness that had once called itself Ambassador Sethkri, a crystal being remembered the fear and confusion of those first days after humanity's disappearance, and felt something that could only be described as gratitude. They had been so afraid of losing their individual identity that they had almost missed the opportunity to discover what that identity could become when it was no longer limited by the illusion of separation. The galaxy had learned the most human lesson of all: sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find out who you really are.